I
The
must
moment
say,
my
Mother,
daughter-in-law
the
called
pie
me a
looks
beggar, everyone at the
absolutely
dinner table
charming.
laughed. I
A
sat there
pity about
holding
the
the apple
recipe,
pie I
though.
had baked that
You
morning
call
while
this an
Madison
apple
lifted her
pie? It
wine
looks as
glass and
tired
said,
and outdated as
"Some
you
people
do, Mother.
arrive dressed for
Honestly,
dinner,
I
but
expected
still
better
look
than
like
this soggy
beggars."
mess.
Nobody spoke, not even my
We
son
need to
Ethan.
discuss the contents of this
Then
folder
she looked
immediately.
directly at me. "For someone who contributes nothing, you certainly enjoy eating at our table." My hands trembled, but I didn't cry. Instead, I reached into my purse and placed a thick folder on the table. "Ethan," I said quietly, "before anyone says another word, you need to read these papers." My son opened the folder. Within seconds, all the color disappeared from his face. People often assume that a woman living alone in a small house must be lonely. Sometimes they are right. My name is Jordyn Scott, and I was 68 years old when my daughter-in-law called me a beggar in front of an entire dining room. But that night did not begin at Madison's table. It began years earlier in a quiet little house outside Columbus, Ohio, where I learned that silence can sometimes cost more than speaking. My husband Richard died 7 years before that dinner. Cancer took him slowly. For 42 years, we had shared the same morning coffee, the same church pew, and the same bedroom with faded blue curtains that he refused to replace because he said they reminded him of our first apartment. After he passed away, the house became too quiet. I still woke up at 6 every morning because Richard always had. I still made 2 cups of coffee before remembering that only one of us remained. People told me to move. My friends said I should sell the house. Some suggested retirement communities. But that little brick home carried every memory of my marriage, every birthday, every Christmas, and every photograph hanging in the hallway. So I stayed. My days became simple. I planted tomatoes in the backyard. I volunteered twice a week at the church food pantry. I baked bread every Sunday. I read books in the evenings while old jazz records played softly in the living room. I had enough money to live comfortably, though nobody would have guessed it. Richard and I had always lived carefully. He worked as an electrician. I spent nearly 30 years as a school bookkeeper. We saved every extra dollar because we wanted our son to have opportunities we never had. That son was Ethan. When Ethan was born, Richard cried in the hospital room. He held our tiny baby against his chest and promised that our son would never know what it felt like to grow up without choices. We kept that promise. When Ethan wanted to attend engineering school, tuition seemed impossible. Richard worked overtime. I took evening bookkeeping jobs. We canceled vacations. I sold jewelry that my mother had left me. There were years when Richard and I shared one old car because we couldn't afford two, but Ethan graduated. I can still see him walking across the stage in his cap and gown, while Richard squeezed my hand so tightly that my fingers hurt. "We did it," my husband whispered, and we had. For many years, Ethan remained close to us. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday, phone calls during his lunch breaks. When Richard became sick, Ethan visited often. He sat beside his father's bed and listened to stories he had already heard 100 times. After Richard died, Ethan became my strength. He cut the grass. He fixed broken shelves. He checked my smoke detectors. Some evenings, he would sit at my kitchen table while I made soup, and we would talk about nothing important at all. Those evenings saved me. Then he met Madison. At first, I liked her. She was beautiful, confident, and energetic. She sold luxury real estate and spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she could solve every problem in the world. She brought expensive wine to dinner. She wore elegant clothes. She complimented my cooking. When Ethan told me he wanted to marry her, I hugged him and said exactly what every mother says. "If she makes you happy, then I'm happy." And I meant it. The first changes were small. Madison asked why I still drove my old sedan. She asked why I didn't renovate my kitchen. She suggested that my clothes looked a little dated. She once looked around my living room and said, "You'd be surprised how much this house could sell for if it were updated." I laughed. She didn't. At family dinners, she talked about expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, and people I had never heard of. I often sat quietly while she described houses worth millions of dollars. Sometimes she would stop and ask, "Jordyn, do you know where Aspen is?" Or, "Have you ever stayed at a resort in Napa?" The answer was always no. She smiled politely each time. Ethan rarely noticed. He loved her. And when people are deeply in love, they often miss the little cuts happening right beside them. One afternoon, about a year after their wedding, Ethan visited me alone. We sat on the back porch drinking iced tea. "I think we're ready to buy a house," he said. His eyes sparkled, the same eyes Richard had. I was happy for him, but I also knew housing prices had risen dramatically. Ethan admitted they were struggling with the down payment. Madison wanted a larger home in a nicer neighborhood. The mortgage would be difficult. He never asked me for money, not once. In fact, he looked embarrassed, even discussing it. That night after he left, I opened the wooden box Richard had kept inside our bedroom closet. Inside were savings accounts, investments, and insurance money. Richard had always told me one thing: if Ethan ever truly needs help, help him. Several weeks later, I met my friend Claire Reynolds for lunch. Claire had practiced law for over 30 years before retiring. She had known Richard and me since college. "I want to help Ethan buy his house," I told her. She smiled. "Then help him." "I don't want him to feel like he owes me." Claire stirred her coffee. "Then do it quietly." And that is exactly what I did. I used some of our savings. I made arrangements through legal channels. Certain documents were prepared. Some protections were added. I never discussed it with Ethan. I certainly never discussed it with Madison. At least, that is what I believed. Months later, they moved into a beautiful home. Large kitchen, stone fireplace, 3-car garage. Madison proudly posted photographs online. She wrote captions about hard work and success. Friends congratulated them. I simply pressed the little heart button and remained silent. During the housewarming party, I walked through the rooms slowly. I imagined Richard standing beside me. He would have been proud, not because of the size of the house, but because his son finally had the opportunities he had worked his entire life to provide. As the evening ended, Madison hugged guests goodbye. When she reached me, she smiled politely. "Thank you for coming, Jordyn." For some reason, she did not say thank you for anything else. I noticed it, but I ignored it, because mothers become experts at ignoring pain. Months passed. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became rare. Sometimes I called Ethan and reached voicemail. Sometimes he sounded distracted. Sometimes Madison answered and said they were busy. I told myself that married couples need space. I told myself that work was stressful. I told myself many things. But every evening after washing the dinner dishes, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen and looked at the empty chair where Richard used to sit. And for the first time since losing my husband, I began to feel something even harder than grief. I began to feel forgotten. The first year after Ethan married Madison, I convinced myself that every uncomfortable feeling was simply part of adjusting to a new family. After all, marriage changes people. Priorities shift. Schedules become complicated. Young couples deserve privacy. That was what I told myself every time another Sunday dinner was canceled. It was what I told myself when Ethan forgot my birthday lunch because Madison had arranged a weekend trip to Chicago. And it was what I repeated in my head whenever I felt like a guest in my own son's life. Still, there were moments when the truth quietly revealed itself. The first time I visited Ethan and Madison after they moved into their new house, Madison gave me a tour of every room. She proudly pointed out the marble countertops, the imported light fixtures, and the custom cabinets. "This kitchen alone cost almost $30,000, she said. I smiled. It's beautiful. She glanced at my shoes. They probably cost more than your entire kitchen renovation. She laughed afterward, as if it were a joke. I laughed too. Older women become experts at laughing at things that hurt. Ethan never heard the comment. He was outside unloading boxes from his truck. As the months passed, Madison's remarks became more frequent. Sometimes they were small. Sometimes they arrived wrapped inside compliments. One afternoon, she accompanied Ethan to my house. I had made chicken soup and homemade bread. She sat at my kitchen table looking around the room. The wallpaper was old. The cabinets needed paint. The curtains had faded. She folded her napkin neatly. "You've lived here a long time." 40 years, I said. She nodded. I couldn't do it. I smiled politely. Do what? Live so simply. Her words settled heavily between us. I suppose I never needed much. Madison sipped her tea. I guess some people are comfortable with less. Again, I said nothing. That evening, after they left, I stood alone in my kitchen. For the first time, I wondered if Madison saw me as a person at all, or simply as an old woman who no longer mattered. A few weeks later, Ethan called me. Mom Madison is having some people over Saturday. Oh, her co-workers, a few clients, some friends. That sounds nice. There was a pause. She thought maybe you could come too. His voice sounded uncertain. I noticed it immediately. Only if you want me there. Of course I do. But something inside me hesitated. I had attended enough gatherings to understand that Madison carefully managed appearances. Her clothes, her house, her friends, even her social media photographs looked professionally staged. Everything had to look successful. Perfect. And I certainly did not fit into her version of perfect. Still, I agreed. The dinner itself wasn't unpleasant, at least not openly. Most of the guests worked in real estate finance or sales. The men discussed investments. The women talked about vacation homes and private schools. I mostly listened. One woman asked me what I used to do. I was a school bookkeeper. Her smile became polite. Oh. Another guest asked whether I had retired. Several years ago, Madison answered before I could continue. Jordyn enjoys a very quiet life. Something about the way she said it felt dismissive, as though quiet meant insignificant. Later that evening, while I helped clear dishes, I overheard two women speaking in the kitchen. Is that Ethan's mother? Yes. She seems sweet. Madison lowered her voice. She's very old-fashioned. The woman laughed. Well, she raised a good son, Madison answered softly. Thankfully, Ethan learned ambition somewhere else. I stood frozen beside the sink. For several seconds, I couldn't move. My hands remained submerged in warm water. My chest hurt, not because of the insult, but because she believed it. She truly believed that my life had nothing to teach, that my sacrifices meant nothing, that my son's success somehow appeared without the people who spent decades building it. On the drive home, I cried. Not heavily, just quietly. The kind of tears older women often hide because nobody wants to hear them. When I arrived home, I sat in Richard's old chair. His reading glasses still rested on the small table beside it. Sometimes I talked to him. That night, I did. I don't know how to reach our son anymore. The room remained silent, but I could almost hear his answer. Be patient. Richard always believed patience solved everything. Unfortunately, patience sometimes allows problems to grow. Months passed. Ethan became busier. Madison became more distant. She rarely called me by my first name anymore. Instead, she used phrases like Ethan's mom. At Thanksgiving, she asked me to bring rolls because she said everything else was already taken care of. At Christmas, she gave me scented candles while everyone else exchanged expensive gifts. I never cared about presents, but the message was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, my friend Claire visited. She had known me long enough to recognize sadness. "You've been quiet lately." I poured tea. "I'm fine." "No, you aren't," I smiled. "I think Madison dislikes me." Claire leaned back. "I've thought that for 2 years." I laughed softly. "Thank you for your honesty." "Have you talked to Ethan?" I shook my head. "I don't want him to choose." Claire looked directly at me. "Sometimes people don't realize they're choosing." Her words stayed with me. Several days later, Ethan called unexpectedly. "Mom, are you busy next Friday?" "No. Madison wants to host a dinner." I hesitated. "What kind of dinner?" "A few clients, some friends. Her parents might come." "Oh." "She specifically asked if you could come." That surprised me. Madison rarely requested my presence. "When?" 7 o'clock. I heard exhaustion in his voice. "Everything okay?" "Just work." He paused. "Mom." "Yes." "I miss you." The words caught me off guard. "I miss you too." After we hung up, I stood beside my kitchen window for a long time. Outside, the autumn leaves were beginning to fall. The air felt colder. The trees looked bare. For reasons I could not explain, uneasiness settled inside me. Claire called that evening. "You sound troubled." "I've been invited to dinner." "By Madison?" "Yes." Claire became quiet. "That's unusual." "I know." "What are you thinking?" I looked around my empty kitchen. "I think maybe this is an opportunity." Or, I sighed, or maybe I'm walking into something I don't understand. The following day, I opened my closet. Most of my clothes were old. Simple sweaters, church dresses, comfortable shoes, nothing expensive, nothing fashionable. I finally chose a navy blue dress that Richard had loved years earlier. I held it against my chest. "You always said blue suited me." For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. Perhaps Madison wanted peace. Perhaps Ethan had spoken to her. Perhaps families simply go through difficult seasons. I even decided to bake my apple pie. It had always been Ethan's favorite. As I mixed cinnamon into the filling, I imagined us sitting together after dinner, talking, laughing, healing. I had no way of knowing that this invitation would change everything. And I certainly did not know that before the night ended, my daughter-in-law would call me a beggar in front of strangers, or that my son would finally begin to see the truth. The Friday of Madison's dinner arrived with cold autumn rain. I woke before sunrise. For some reason, I felt nervous. Not the kind of nervousness people feel before doctor's appointments or important meetings. This feeling sat deeper somewhere behind my ribs where mothers store their fears. I made coffee and stood beside my kitchen window. The maple tree in my yard had lost most of its leaves. The branches looked bare against the gray Ohio sky. Richard always loved rainy days. He used to say rain forced people to slow down and think. That morning, I found myself thinking about Ethan. I remembered his first day of school, his high school graduation, the day he left for college, the night he brought Madison home for dinner. Every memory seemed to belong to another lifetime. After breakfast, I decided to bake the apple pie. It had always been Ethan's favorite dessert. When he was 10 years old, he once ate 3 slices and became so sick that Richard spent half the night sitting beside his bed. Even years later, Ethan would smile whenever he smelled cinnamon and baked apples. As I peeled the apples, I wondered if he still remembered. Perhaps that was what aging really was. Not forgetting your memories, but wondering whether other people still carried them. By noon, the pie had cooled. The house smelled warm and sweet. I carefully wrapped it and placed it inside a carrier. Then, I opened my closet. Most of my clothes looked exactly the same as they had 5 years earlier. Simple dresses, cardigans, comfortable shoes. Nothing that Madison would consider fashionable. I finally chose the navy blue dress Richard loved. The fabric had faded slightly, but it still fit. I brushed my gray hair, applied a little lipstick, added the pearl earrings Richard bought me on our 25th anniversary. When I looked in the mirror, I saw an old woman. But I also saw someone who had survived loss. Someone who had worked hard. Someone who had loved deeply. That had to be enough. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Claire. "Ready for tonight?" I laughed softly. "I don't know." "You don't have to go." "I think I do." She became quiet. "Trust your instincts, Jordyn." What if my instincts are wrong? What if they aren't? After hanging up, I sat alone in my living room. Part of me wanted to stay home, to call Ethan and say I wasn't feeling well, to avoid whatever uncomfortable evening waited ahead. But another part of me still hoped. A mother's hope can survive almost anything. At 6 o'clock, I placed the pie in my car. The rain had stopped. The roads glistened beneath the streetlights. As I drove toward Ethan's neighborhood, I noticed how much the area had changed. New homes, expensive landscaping, luxury vehicles parked in wide driveways. Everything looked polished, perfect. When I arrived, several cars already lined the street. Large SUVs, luxury sedans, vehicles that cost more than my first house. The lights inside Ethan's home glowed warmly. I took a deep breath, picked up the pie, and walked toward the front door. Madison answered almost immediately. She wore a beautiful black dress. Diamond earrings sparkled beneath the lights. For a moment, she looked surprised to see me. "Oh, Jordyn, I hope I'm not late." "No." Her eyes moved to the pie carrier. "You brought something." "Apple pie, Ethan's favorite." She smiled politely. "We already have dessert." "Oh." I suddenly felt foolish. "I can take it back." She sighed. "No, that's fine." She stepped aside. As I entered, voices filled the house. There were perhaps 12 people. Some I recognized from previous gatherings. Others were strangers. Music played softly. Wine glasses clinked. Everyone looked comfortable. Everyone except me. Ethan appeared from the kitchen. His face brightened. "Mom." He hugged me. For a moment, I felt relief. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." He looked tired. There were shadows beneath his eyes. His smile seemed forced. Before I could ask whether he was all right, Madison called his name from across the room. "Ethan, can you help Jason with the wine?" He apologized and disappeared. I stood alone beside the doorway. One of Madison's friends approached me. "I don't think we've met. I'm Jordyn." "Oh, Ethan's mother." She smiled kindly. "Your son has done very well." "Yes, he has." Madison suddenly appeared beside us. "Ethan works incredibly hard." She placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. "We've built a wonderful life together." Something about her emphasis caught my attention. We built together. The woman nodded. "You should be proud." Madison answered before I could. "Oh, Jordyn likes a much simpler lifestyle. Again, that word, simple. As if simplicity were another word for failure. Dinner was announced shortly afterward. The dining table had been beautifully arranged. Candles, crystal glasses, white plates, fresh flowers, name cards. I searched for mine. My seat sat at the far end of the table, not beside Ethan, not near Madison, not even close to the center. I sat beside two people I had never met. Across from me sat Madison's business partner. Next to him was a woman who spent most of the evening discussing investment properties. Meanwhile, Ethan sat beside Madison at the opposite end. I tried not to feel hurt. Perhaps the seating arrangement meant nothing. Perhaps I was being too sensitive. But when dessert plates appeared, I noticed something else. My pie remained in the kitchen. Madison had ordered an expensive cake from a bakery. As guests complimented it, she smiled proudly. No one mentioned the apple pie. At one point, a man asked me whether I had retired comfortably. Yes. You must have planned well. Before I could answer, Madison laughed. Jordyn doesn't need much. Several guests smiled. One woman asked, Do you travel? Not often. Madison sipped her wine. She prefers staying home. The conversation moved on, but each small comment seemed carefully chosen. Not cruel enough to challenge, only enough to diminish. Halfway through dinner, Ethan excused himself to answer a phone call. The moment he left the room, something changed. Madison relaxed. Her smile became sharper. One of her friends asked whether family helped them buy the house. Madison laughed. Oh, no! Ethan and I worked for everything. Another guest nodded. That's impressive these days. Madison raised her glass. We built this life ourselves. I lowered my eyes, because that wasn't entirely true. And for the first time in years, I wondered whether Madison actually knew. Had Ethan ever told her? Had someone else? Had she seen documents? The thought unsettled me. When Ethan returned, the conversation shifted. But I noticed something. Madison watched me, not casually, carefully, almost as if she expected something, as if tonight had a purpose beyond dinner. As the evening continued, I became increasingly uncomfortable. People drank more wine. Voices became louder. Madison told stories about clients, about luxury homes, about successful people. Several times she glanced toward me, and each time I felt as though I was being measured, judged, compared. By 9 o'clock, I wanted to leave, but Ethan finally sat beside me for the first time all evening. You okay, Mom? I smiled. Of course. He looked unconvinced. I've been busy tonight. I know. He touched my hand. I'm glad you came. Before I could answer, Madison stood. She lifted her wine glass. I want to make a toast. The room became quiet. Everyone looked toward her. She smiled beautifully, confidently. And for reasons I still cannot explain, fear suddenly settled inside me. Because the way she looked at me was not the way family looks at family. It was the way someone looks at an audience before beginning a performance. And somehow, I knew I was about to become part of it. Madison stood beside the dining table with her wine glass raised. The candles reflected against the crystal in her hand. Everyone stopped talking. Even the soft music playing in the background suddenly seemed distant. I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight, she said warmly. Several guests smiled. She continued. It's wonderful to be surrounded by successful people who understand how hard work builds a beautiful life. People nodded. A few glasses lifted. I looked toward Ethan. He sat beside his wife, though his shoulders seemed tense. Madison reached over and squeezed his hand. I'm especially grateful for Ethan. Everything we have came from our sacrifices and determination. Again, several guests applauded softly. I lowered my eyes toward my plate. Something inside me felt uncomfortable, not because of what she said, but because of what she left unsaid. I remembered the nights Richard worked overtime, the years we saved every dollar, the sacrifices we made so our son could begin his adult life without crushing debt. Yet none of that mattered now, at least not in this room. Madison took another sip of wine. Then she laughed. And of course, every family has different attitudes about life. Several guests smiled politely. She slowly turned toward me. My stomach tightened. Some people believe ambition matters. She paused. Others simply learn to depend on those around them. A few people looked at me. I forced a smile. Perhaps she would stop. She didn't. Personally, I think adults should contribute to the table they sit at. The room grew quiet. Ethan frowned slightly. Madison? She touched his arm. I'm only speaking honestly. One of her friends laughed nervously. Nobody understood where the conversation was heading. Except me. Because for the first time all evening, Madison stopped pretending. She looked directly into my eyes. I admire people who work for what they have. My hands rested quietly in my lap. I agree, she smiled. But unfortunately, not everyone does. The silence became heavier. Even the guests seemed uncomfortable. Ethan cleared his throat. Maybe we should have dessert. Madison ignored him. She set her glass down. Some people spend their entire lives taking from others. I felt my heartbeat quicken. No one moved. No one spoke. I remember hearing the clock in the kitchen. Tick, tick, tick. Madison folded her hands. And some people become so comfortable depending on family that they forget their own responsibilities. Ethan finally spoke. Madison, enough. She looked at him. I'm not saying anything that isn't true. My son looked confused. What are you talking about? She laughed softly. Your mother. The room became completely silent. One woman lowered her eyes. Another guest shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I felt heat rising into my face, yet strangely, I remained calm. Years of grief had taught me something. Pain arrives in waves. The first wave shocks you. The second wave numbs you. By the third wave, you simply survive. Madison looked around the table. People should know the truth. Ethan stared at her. What truth? She crossed her arms. That your mother depends on you. I blinked. Ethan looked surprised. What? She's alone. She lives modestly. She doesn't travel. She doesn't work. Her voice became sharper. And yet she enjoys all the benefits of having a successful son. I heard someone quietly inhale. Another guest looked away. I could see embarrassment spreading across the room. Not because they agreed, because they didn't know where to look. Ethan spoke again. Mom has never asked me for money. Madison smiled. Directly, no. I stared at her. My hands had stopped trembling. Something inside me had become very still, very clear. She truly believed this, or perhaps she wanted everyone else to believe it. Either way, the result was the same. She continued speaking. Some people spend their lives contributing. Others simply appear whenever dinner is served. One man quietly placed his fork down. The woman beside me looked horrified. I still said nothing. Ethan looked between us. Madison, stop. She ignored him. Frankly, I think families sometimes allow this behavior because they feel guilty. She laughed lightly. But eventually, everyone has to stop acting like a beggar. The word landed in the center of the room. Beggar. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. For several seconds, all I could hear was the sound of rain beginning again against the windows. Ethan looked stunned. "Did you just call my mother a beggar?" Madison lifted one shoulder. "If the shoe fits." A nervous laugh escaped from someone at the far end of the table. Another person immediately looked ashamed. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. I looked at my son. He looked back at me. And in his eyes, for the first time all evening, I saw confusion. Because Ethan honestly did not understand. He did not understand why his wife believed these things. He did not understand why I remained silent. He did not understand what was about to happen. Madison leaned back in her chair. "You know, sometimes people dress nicely for dinner, but they're still beggars underneath." The words finally reached somewhere deep inside me, not because they hurt, but because they told me something important. She knew nothing about me, nothing about Richard, nothing about our sacrifices, nothing about the choices I had made for my son. And suddenly, I realized something else. She may not have known the truth, but she had certainly benefited from it. I slowly placed my napkin beside my plate. Nobody spoke. I stood carefully. At 68 years old, your movements become deliberate. There is no rushing, no dramatic gestures, only decisions. I picked up my purse from the chair beside me. Madison watched me. Perhaps she thought I would cry. Perhaps she expected me to leave. Perhaps she wanted exactly that. Instead, I opened my purse. Inside sat a thick folder, cream-colored, worn slightly at the edges. The folder Claire had told me never to lose. The folder I had carried for years. The folder I had never expected to use. My fingers rested on it for a moment. I thought of Richard. I thought of every overtime shift, every sacrifice, every promise we made to our son. Then I removed the folder. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Madison frowned. "What is that?" I looked at her calmly. Nothing in my voice shook. Nothing in my hands trembled. I placed the folder in the center of the table. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Ethan stared at it. "Mom!" I turned toward my son. My voice was barely above a whisper. "Ethan, before anyone says another word, I think you should read these." The room became completely silent. Madison laughed nervously. "What is this supposed to be?" I did not answer her. I kept my eyes on my son. He slowly reached for the folder. His fingers hesitated. Something in my expression must have frightened him, because suddenly the color drained from his face. "Mom." "Open it." The rain outside grew heavier. One guest quietly stood and moved away from the table. Another looked toward the kitchen. Nobody understood. Not yet, but everyone felt it. The evening had changed. Whatever game Madison believed she was playing had just ended, and for the first time all night, I saw fear appear in her eyes. The folder sat between us. No one touched their wine. No one reached for dessert. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Ethan stared at the folder as though it might contain something dangerous. Madison folded her arms. "This is ridiculous." I kept my eyes on my son. "Open it." His fingers slowly lifted the cover. The first page rested neatly on top. Several legal documents, property records, transfer agreements, bank confirmations. Ethan frowned. "What is this?" "Keep reading." The room remained completely silent. I could hear the clock in the kitchen, the soft sound of rain. the crackling fire in the living room. Ethan turned another page, then another. His eyes moved back to the first document. He read a name, read it again, and suddenly the color disappeared from his face. He looked up at me. "Mom." Madison leaned forward. "What is it?" Ethan swallowed. The paper shook slightly in his hand. "This says—" He stopped. The room waited. "This says the original down payment came from Jordyn Scott." Nobody spoke. Madison laughed. "That can't be right." Ethan looked at another document. "It says the funds were transferred before closing." Madison reached toward the papers. "Let me see that." He didn't hand them to her. For the first time all evening, my son seemed completely focused. He turned another page. Bank statements, escrow records, legal agreements. The documents had been prepared carefully years earlier. Claire had insisted on that. "You never know what life brings," she had told me. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. Now I understood. Ethan looked at me. "You paid the down payment?" I nodded. The room remained frozen. "Why?" My voice came quietly. "Because you needed help." Madison immediately shook her head. "No." She looked at Ethan. "This doesn't make sense." He continued reading. The amount was there. The dates, the signatures, the financial transfer. Every page told the same story. One guest quietly stood and walked toward the kitchen. Another stared down at his plate. No one wanted to witness what was happening, but no one could leave. Ethan looked at me again. "You gave us this money." "Yes." His eyes filled with confusion. "You never told me." "You never asked." Madison finally spoke. "Jordyn, what exactly are you trying to do?" I looked at her. "I'm answering your questions." She laughed nervously. "This doesn't change anything." I said nothing. Because she was wrong. Everything had already changed. Ethan turned another page. His forehead tightened. "What is this?" I recognized the document immediately. Claire had insisted it remain inside the file. A legal agreement regarding ownership protections. Not because I distrusted Ethan, but because Richard had asked me to protect our savings. My son looked stunned. "The house." His voice became weak. Madison leaned closer. "What?" He looked directly at me. "The property interest is registered under your name." The room became silent again. This time, even Madison stopped speaking. "What does that mean?" one guest asked quietly. Ethan read slowly. "It means Mom retained ownership rights connected to the original purchase agreement." Madison immediately stood. "That's impossible." I remained seated. "No, it isn't." She looked at me. "You put your name on our house." "Our house." The words escaped before I could stop them. The room became still. I had never corrected her before, never challenged her, never defended myself. But something inside me had changed. I looked at Ethan. "Do you remember when you came to me before buying the house?" He nodded slowly. "You said you were worried." He lowered his eyes. "I remember." "You said you couldn't afford the down payment," Madison interrupted. "We figured it out ourselves." I finally looked directly at her. "No, you didn't." No anger, no shouting, just truth. The kind that hurts because it doesn't need to raise its voice. Ethan stared at the papers. "I thought the bank approved everything." "They approved the mortgage," I said, "but not the money you needed to close." He looked completely lost. Why didn't you tell me? I smiled sadly. Because your father and I spent our entire lives helping you without making you feel ashamed. The mention of Richard seemed to fill the room. Even after 7 years, his presence still lived between my son and me. I continued. When your father was dying, he asked me something. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He said, if our son ever needed help, help him. The room remained quiet. He didn't say to keep score. I paused. He didn't say to ask for praise. My voice grew softer. He certainly didn't say to ask permission. Ethan looked down. His hands trembled. Meanwhile, Madison's expression had begun to change. The confidence was gone. The control she had carried all evening slowly disappeared. She looked at me carefully, almost fearfully, and suddenly I understood something. She knew more than she had admitted. Perhaps not everything, but enough. She had never once asked where the down payment came from. She had never questioned how 2 middle-income professionals purchased such an expensive home. She simply accepted it, or perhaps she chose not to ask. One of the guests finally spoke. You helped them buy the house. I nodded. Another woman looked toward Madison. And she didn't know. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Not yet. Ethan looked at his wife. Did you know about this? Madison's eyes widened. No. He continued staring. Did you? She hesitated, only for a second. But it was enough, and Ethan saw it. I watched my son closely. Because mothers learn to read their children, he had seen something. A hesitation, a recognition, a memory, something. Madison spoke quickly. Maybe your mother mentioned something years ago. I didn't, I answered immediately. She looked at me. Perhaps through the attorney. Claire never discussed your finances. The room felt colder. Madison crossed her arms. Fine. Her voice sharpened. So, you gave us money. She looked around the table. Parents help their children all the time. Several guests avoided eye contact, because that wasn't the issue anymore. She had called me a beggar. She had accused me of living off my son. And now, everyone understood that the opposite might be true. Ethan slowly closed the folder. He looked exhausted. When were you going to tell me? I answered honestly. Never. His eyes lifted. Why? Because I didn't give it to control you. My throat tightened. I gave it because I loved you. The room became quiet again. One of Madison's friends wiped her eyes. Another guest quietly excused himself. The evening was falling apart, and everyone knew it. Madison suddenly laughed, a hard, nervous laugh. Fine. She looked at the guests. So Jordyn gave us money years ago. She turned toward me. That doesn't give you ownership of our lives. I met her eyes. I never wanted ownership. She frowned. Then why keep the papers? For the first time, I thought of Claire. Her warning, her advice, her careful voice. Protect yourself. Protect your husband's work. Protect your son's future. I answered honestly. Because Richard spent 40 years earning that money. I looked toward Ethan. And because your father wanted me to make sure it protected you. My son lowered his head. The rain outside had become heavy now. Thunder rolled in the distance. No one moved. No one reached for dessert. My apple pie still sat untouched in the kitchen. And suddenly, I realized something. Tonight had never been about money. Not really. It had been about dignity, about respect, about being seen. Madison had tried to reduce my entire life to a single cruel word: beggar. But the papers lying on that table were only the beginning, because beneath them sat another section, another collection of documents, another truth. One I had prayed would never become necessary. As Ethan placed the folder down, several papers shifted. A second bundle appeared underneath. Bank letters, statements, copies. And when Madison saw them, her face changed. The blood drained from her cheeks. Because unlike the first papers, she recognized these immediately. Madison's eyes locked onto the second bundle of papers. Until that moment, she had still believed she could recover. She had lost control of the dinner. She had lost the support of the guests, but she still thought the worst had passed. Then she saw the bank envelopes, and for the first time that night, I saw genuine fear. Ethan noticed it too. He looked from the documents to his wife. "Madison?" She forced a smile. "What?" His voice grew quieter. "Why do you look like that?" She crossed her arms. "I don't know what those papers are." I sat perfectly still. The room had become so silent that the rain against the windows sounded loud. One of the guests quietly stood. "I think maybe we should leave." "No." Ethan's voice surprised everyone, including me. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he sounded desperate. He looked at me. "Mom, what is this?" I took a slow breath. "The first papers explain how you bought this house." My fingers touched the second stack. "The second papers explain why I finally brought the first ones tonight." Madison immediately spoke. "That's enough." Nobody looked at her. For the first time in years, no one was listening to Madison. Not her friends, not her guests, not even her husband. Ethan slowly opened the second section. The first page contained copies of credit statements. The second contained loan documents. The third contained letters from financial institutions. His forehead tightened. "I don't understand." I nodded. I didn't either. Several months earlier, I had received a letter by mistake. The envelope had arrived at my house because one of the original legal documents still contained my mailing information. At first, I assumed it was harmless, an error, something from the mortgage company. But when I opened it, I discovered notices about a line of credit, large amounts, balances I had never seen before. I called Claire. She came to my house that same afternoon. "I think this belongs to Ethan." Claire read the letter carefully. Her expression changed. "No." "What do you mean?" She looked at me. "This involves the property." I still remember the cold feeling that spread through my body. "What kind of involvement?" She pointed to several numbers. "Someone used the house as financial collateral." I couldn't breathe. "Does Ethan know?" "I don't know." That answer terrified me. Back at the dinner table, Ethan continued reading. His face became paler with every page. "What are these loans?" Madison spoke quickly. "Business expenses." He looked at her. "What business?" She hesitated. "My real estate expenses." $28,000? No answer. Another page, another statement, another account. The guests sat motionless. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted to become part of this. Yet nobody could look away. Ethan turned another page. "What is this signature?" Madison immediately reached toward the documents. "Give me those." He pulled them back. His voice changed. The gentle son I knew had disappeared. "Whose signature is this?" She swallowed. "I signed it." "That's my name." Silence. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the kitchen, ice shifted inside a melting glass. Madison spoke carefully. "You knew about it." His eyes never left the paper. "No." She looked around the room. "This isn't what it looks like." Nobody answered, because nobody knew what it looked like anymore. I looked down at my hands. They no longer trembled, perhaps because the truth had finally arrived, perhaps because the burden was no longer mine alone. Months earlier, after discovering the first letters, Claire had advised me to investigate quietly. Not because we wanted trouble, because we feared it. We learned that several loans had been taken. Credit accounts, financial agreements, home-related borrowing. Some carried Ethan's information. Some involved property documents. Some raised questions. Claire had told me something I would never forget. "Jordyn, there may be explanations. And if there aren't..." She had remained silent. That silence frightened me more than any answer. I had wanted to speak to Ethan immediately, but Claire stopped me. "First, determine whether he knows." And so I waited. I watched. I listened. And over time, I began noticing things. Ethan seemed exhausted. Bills piled up. Phone calls interrupted dinners. Madison became increasingly defensive whenever money was mentioned. Meanwhile, Ethan continued believing they were simply busy, successful, growing. He had no idea. At the table, he lifted another document. "This says the application used my income." Madison looked at him. "We're married." His voice became harder. "I never signed this." A woman across the table quietly whispered, "Oh my God." Madison suddenly stood. "This is unbelievable." Ethan looked up. "Did you do this?" "No." "You signed my name." "No." He held up the document. "It says, Jordyn Scott." Her breathing quickened. I had permission. When... She didn't answer. For years I had watched my son avoid conflict. Even as a child, he hated arguments. He hated disappointment. He wanted everyone to be happy. Perhaps that was why Madison had been able to control so much, because Ethan always chose peace, even when peace required silence. But tonight, something had changed. He finally looked directly at his wife, and for the first time, he wasn't asking. He was seeing. Madison turned toward me. "You did this." The accusation startled several guests. I looked at her calmly. "What exactly did I do?" "You wanted him to hate me." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was tragic. "I spent years trying to protect my son's marriage." She pointed at the papers. "You brought this here." "Tonight..." My voice remained soft. "Yes." "And why do you think I brought them tonight?" She had no answer. Because she knew. Because everyone knew. I had not arrived planning to expose anyone. I had come carrying an apple pie. I had come hoping for reconciliation. I had come wearing the dress my husband loved, and she had called me a beggar. Ethan looked down again. His voice became very quiet. "Mom." I turned toward him. "When did you find these?" "Months ago." His eyes widened. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my son. Because this was the hardest truth. Because I didn't know whether you already knew. He stared at me. Pain crossed his face. "You thought I was involved." Tears finally filled my eyes. "I prayed you weren't." The room became completely still, because that sentence hurt more than everything else. Not Madison's insults, not the dinner, not the humiliation, only that fear. The fear that perhaps my son had become someone I no longer recognized. Ethan lowered his head. He began crying quietly. The same little boy who once brought me dandelions, the same young man who sat beside his dying father, the same son who had somehow become lost. Madison's voice shook. Ethan, listen to me. He didn't look up. I can explain. Still nothing. I was protecting us. He finally lifted his eyes. There was no anger, only heartbreak. From who? She opened her mouth. No words came. He looked around the room. The guests, the empty plates, the untouched pie, his mother, his wife, the life he believed he understood. And slowly, painfully, the truth began settling inside him. The woman he trusted had hidden things. The mother he neglected had protected him. And the person he had allowed everyone to judge had been carrying his burdens in silence. Madison stepped closer. Ethan. He raised his hand, not angrily, simply enough to stop her. And for the first time since the evening began, his voice carried a strength I had not heard in years. I need the truth. No one moved. No one spoke. Because everyone understood. The dinner was over. The marriage itself might be ending. And the next words spoken in that room would change every life sitting around that table. Nobody spoke after Ethan said those 4 words. I need the truth. The rain continued outside. Several candles had begun to burn low. The expensive dinner sat untouched. Wine glasses stood half full. And somewhere in the kitchen, my apple pie remained exactly where I had left it. Madison slowly sat down. For the first time since I had known her, she looked small. Not because of her appearance, because she no longer controlled the room. Ethan stared at her. Please, answer me. Her voice shook. I was trying to protect us. From what? The bills. He looked confused. What bills? She looked away. The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, she spoke. When the market slowed down, I lost several clients. I listened quietly. This was the first time I had heard any of it. My commissions dropped. Ethan frowned. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want you to worry. He looked at the documents. $28,000. She swallowed. Then 36. The room became silent again. One of her friends covered her mouth. Apparently, even they had known nothing. Madison continued. I thought things would improve. Ethan's voice grew harder. So, you borrowed money? Yes. Using our house? She nodded. His eyes fell to the papers again. And my signature, her breathing became uneven. I signed them. The words barely escaped her lips. Several people lowered their eyes. A man quietly stood and walked into the living room. No one stopped him. No one blamed him. This had become something private, something painful. Ethan's voice cracked. You forged my name. I was your wife. That isn't an answer. Tears appeared in Madison's eyes. I didn't know what else to do. For years, I had imagined confronting her, imagined anger, imagined accusations. Instead, I felt tired, very tired, because beneath all the arrogance and cruelty, I suddenly saw fear. Not an excuse, but a reason. Claire had once told me something. People who worship appearances usually fear losing them. Looking at Madison now, I finally understood. She had built her entire identity around success. Beautiful houses, luxury cars, expensive dinners, perfect photographs, the admiration of strangers, the idea that she and Ethan had built everything alone, and once the cracks began appearing, she became desperate. Ethan spoke again. "Did you know about my mother's money?" She closed her eyes. For several seconds, she didn't answer. Then she whispered, "Yes." The word landed harder than anything else that evening. I saw Ethan physically react, as though someone had struck him. "You knew?" She nodded. "How?" "During closing." He stared. "You never told me." She looked toward me. "I thought it would embarrass you." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was astonishing. She had hidden my help because she thought it would embarrass my son. Yet she had publicly called me a beggar. Ethan spoke quietly. "So, all these years." She looked down. "I didn't want you to feel dependent." His eyes filled with tears again. "You let me believe my mother needed money." "No. You let me believe she depended on me." "I never said that." I finally spoke. "No, Madison." Everyone turned toward me. "You did." My voice remained calm. Every year of my life suddenly stood beside me. The young wife, the working mother, the widow, the lonely woman sitting in her kitchen, the mother waiting for phone calls, the woman she had called a beggar. I looked directly at her. "You didn't say it once." I paused. "You said it for years." She looked away. "You talked about my clothes." Silence. "You talked about my house." Silence. "You talked about my life." Her tears began falling. "But tonight you finally said what you always believed." No one interrupted, because it was true. Even Ethan knew it. Madison wiped her face. "I was angry." I nodded. "Perhaps." "I felt judged." I almost smiled. "By me?" She hesitated. "You made me feel like I wasn't good enough." That surprised everyone, even me. "How?" She looked around the room. "Because you never cared about money." I said nothing. She continued. "You and Richard saved your entire lives." Her voice trembled. "You had enough to help us." She looked down, and I spent my whole life trying to prove I mattered. The room grew quiet. For the first time, Madison stopped defending herself. She simply spoke. "My parents lost everything when I was young." Ethan looked surprised. She had never told him. "We moved constantly." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I promised myself I would never be poor." Nobody spoke, because suddenly the woman everyone disliked became more complicated. Not innocent, not blameless, but human. She looked at me. "When I learned you helped with the house, I hated it." I felt my chest tighten. "Why?" "Because it meant we weren't successful by ourselves." She looked toward Ethan. "And I wanted him to believe we were." My son closed his eyes. Years of misunderstanding suddenly became visible. The missed phone calls, the canceled dinners, the distance, the embarrassment, the silence. Madison had built a wall, and Ethan had slowly moved behind it. One of the guests quietly gathered her purse. "I think we should go." Another nodded. Within minutes, people began leaving. Nobody wanted to witness what came next. Several guests hugged me. One woman squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry." Another whispered, "You didn't deserve that." I thanked them quietly. Soon, only 4 people remained: Ethan, Madison, myself, and one of Madison's closest friends who sat silently near the kitchen. The house suddenly felt much larger. The expensive dining room now looked cold. The candles had nearly burned out. Ethan sat with the documents spread before him. His voice became almost childlike. "Mom." "Yes." "You paid the down payment." "Yes." "You protected the house." "Yes." "You knew about the loans." I nodded. "And you still said nothing." I looked at him. "I was waiting for my son." He looked confused. "You were here." My voice softened. "No." Tears filled his eyes. "I didn't know." I finally reached across the table and touched his hand. "I know." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Madison sat quietly, broken, exhausted. No longer the confident woman who had raised her wine glass earlier that evening. Then Ethan turned toward her. His voice was calm, too calm. "Did you ever love my mother?" She looked stunned. "What? Did you?" Her tears returned. "I didn't know her." He nodded slowly. "That's the problem." Silence. Then he asked the question that frightened her more than the papers, more than the guests leaving, more than the truth itself. "How many things don't I know?" Madison lowered her head, and in that moment I realized the evening was not over. The papers had revealed the money. They had revealed the house. They had revealed the lies. But the deepest damage had not been financial. It was the years stolen from a mother and her son. And now, sitting in the quiet remains of that dinner party, Ethan was finally beginning to understand how much had been taken from him. The house felt strangely empty after the guests left. Only the sound of rain and the occasional crack of thunder remained. The elegant dinner party Madison had spent weeks planning had disappeared in less than 20 minutes. Half-empty glasses still sat on the table. Plates remained untouched. Candles had nearly burned down to wax. Ethan remained seated. The documents lay scattered in front of him. Madison sat several feet away, staring at the floor. I had never seen either of them look so exhausted. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "How much?" Madison lifted her eyes. "What?" "The total." She swallowed. "I don't know exactly." His voice became sharper. "How much?" She looked down. 48,000. The number settled heavily over the room. I saw Ethan physically react. $48,000? She nodded. "Maybe a little more." He rubbed his forehead. "When?" "Over 2 years." He looked stunned. 2 years? I sat quietly. This conversation belonged to them. But every answer seemed to remove another brick from the wall surrounding my son. He asked another question. "How many accounts?" Madison hesitated. 4. His breathing became heavier. "And everyone used our house." "Some." "Our house that my mother helped us buy." She closed her eyes. Yes. The truth had become unavoidable. For years, Ethan had believed they were building their future together. Now he realized that two separate lives had been existing inside the same marriage, one based on trust, the other based on fear. He picked up another document. This account was opened 18 months ago. Madison said nothing. The second one, 14 months ago. Silence. The third last year. She began crying. I was trying to fix it. He looked up. You kept making it worse. At that moment, my phone vibrated. Claire. I stepped away into the kitchen. Are you all right? She asked immediately. No. Is Ethan there? Yes. And I looked toward the dining room. My son sat with his head lowered. Madison cried quietly. The truth is finally coming out. Claire was silent. Then she said something I would remember. Sometimes people break before they heal. I looked at the untouched apple pie sitting on the counter. I think my son is breaking. Then stay with him. I returned to the dining room. Ethan looked up. Was that Claire? Yes. He nodded slowly. She knew. She helped me understand the documents. His eyes filled with fresh tears. Everyone knew except me. No. I sat beside him. Not everyone. He looked confused. I didn't know either. He studied my face. What do you mean? I knew something was wrong. I paused, but I prayed I was mistaken. He lowered his head. I should have listened to you. I shook my head. I never spoke. His eyes met mine. Maybe because you were afraid. I did not answer, because he was right. I had been afraid of losing my son, afraid of damaging his marriage, afraid of becoming the mother who interfered, afraid of confirming what my heart already suspected. Across the table, Madison finally spoke. I didn't mean to hurt you. She was looking at me. The words surprised me. For years she had defended herself, explained herself, excused herself. But now she simply looked tired. I answered honestly. I believe you. She seemed shocked. But you still hurt me. Tears rolled down her face. I know. The room became quiet again. For the first time, there was no performance, no audience, no social masks, only 3 damaged people sitting around a dining table. Ethan stood suddenly. He walked toward the kitchen. For a moment, I worried he might leave. Instead, he returned carrying the apple pie. He placed it gently in the center of the table. This was my favorite. I smiled sadly. It still is. He stared at the pie. I remember when Dad used to steal pieces before dinner. I laughed softly. So do I. For several seconds, the room changed. Richard somehow entered the conversation. His memory always did that. He brought peace even after death. Ethan looked at me. Did Dad know about the house? He nodded. He asked me to help you if you ever needed it. Tears returned to his eyes. He trusted me. He loved you. He covered his face with his hands. I failed both of you. No, I touched his shoulder. You got lost. He whispered something. What? I abandoned you. The words broke my heart because they were true, not intentionally, not cruelly, but slowly, quietly, over years. He stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped noticing, and mothers rarely complain because they fear sounding selfish. Madison suddenly stood. I'll leave. Neither of us spoke. She looked at Ethan. I think that's best. He stared at the table. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Finally, he answered. I think so too. Those 6 words ended something. Not officially, not legally, but emotionally. Madison nodded. She walked upstairs. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the house. Several minutes later, she returned with a suitcase. I had never imagined seeing this moment. Not because I hated her, because I once wanted her to become my daughter. She stopped beside me. I really did love Ethan. I looked at her. I know. Her voice trembled. I just didn't know how to stop being afraid. I understood more than she realized. Fear had driven nearly everything. Fear of poverty, fear of failure, fear of losing status, fear of appearing weak. She looked down. And I was jealous of you. That surprised me. Why? Because you never needed anyone else's approval. I thought about Richard, our small house, our simple life. Perhaps she was right. She picked up her suitcase. Ethan still hadn't looked at her. Finally, she whispered, I'm sorry. No one answered. The front door opened. Cold air entered. Then she was gone. The house became silent. Only my son and I remained. For a long time, we sat together. Neither of us knew what to say. At nearly midnight, Ethan finally spoke. Mom. Yes. I don't know who I am right now. His honesty hurt me, because I had felt the same after Richard died. When the life you recognize disappears, you feel homeless, even inside your own body. I looked at him. You're still my son. He nodded. But what if I don't deserve that? I reached across the table. At 68 years old, you learn certain things. Life wounds people. People make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. But shame alone cannot heal anyone. Love must still be present. I squeezed his hand. When you were little, you once broke your father's watch. He looked surprised. I remember. You cried for hours. He laughed weakly. I thought he'd be angry. And what did he say? Ethan smiled through tears. He said, watches can be repaired. I nodded. So can people. He cried openly then, not quietly, not politely. Years of pressure, years of guilt, years of distance, all finally breaking. I sat beside him while he cried, just as I had when he was a child, just as I had after his father died. And somewhere in that empty dining room, beside an untouched apple pie and scattered financial papers, my son finally began finding his way back to me. But neither of us yet understood how difficult the coming days would become. Because the dinner had ended. The marriage had cracked. The lies had been exposed. And tomorrow morning, the consequences would begin. Before the next chapter, a quick note according to the approved outline. Part 10 focuses on Ethan's awakening, his memories, and his realization that Madison had gradually separated him from his mother. The legal consequences and final collapse of the marriage will continue in later chapters. I barely slept that night. After Madison left, Ethan remained at the dining table until almost 2 o'clock in the morning. The rain eventually stopped, but the silence inside the house became heavier than the storm itself. Several times, I asked if he wanted me to stay. Several times, he simply nodded. The house felt unfamiliar. The expensive decorations, the polished floors, the beautiful furniture. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet somehow, none of it belonged to the life my son thought he had built. Around midnight, Ethan finally spoke. Did Dad ever feel disappointed in me? The question broke my heart. I looked at him carefully. Never. But he would now. No. He shook his head. I ignored you. I remained quiet. I stopped calling. Still, I said nothing. I let years pass. His voice cracked, and I didn't even notice. The hardest thing about watching someone wake up is that you cannot protect them from the pain of seeing clearly. Ethan stood and walked toward the living room. Richard's old photograph sat inside my purse. I carried it everywhere. Without speaking, I handed it to him. He stared at his father's picture. His shoulders trembled. When Dad was sick, I promised him something. What was that? He swallowed. I promised I would take care of you. Tears filled his eyes. And I failed. I touched his arm. No, Ethan. But I did. He sat down beside me. I don't even know when everything changed. The truth was that I knew. Not exactly when, but how. Change rarely arrives all at once. It happens quietly. Phone calls become shorter. Visits become less frequent. Birthdays become rushed. Conversations become postponed. And eventually, two people who love each other find themselves living in different worlds. At 3 a.m, Ethan finally fell asleep on the couch. I covered him with a blanket. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to fall asleep during movies. The same boy Richard carried upstairs. The same boy who once believed his parents could solve everything. I drove home shortly before sunrise. The roads were empty. The sky above Columbus slowly turned pale gray. When I entered my house, everything felt familiar. Richard's chair, the kitchen table, the old clock. I suddenly realized how long it had been since Ethan last visited. Not for holidays, not for quick repairs, not for coffee, not simply because he wanted to see me. I made tea, sat beside the window, and waited. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Ethan. Mom! His voice sounded exhausted. Yes. Can I come over? Of course. He arrived 30 minutes later. His clothes were wrinkled. His eyes were red. For the first time in years, he walked into my house without checking his phone, without rushing, without saying he only had a few minutes. He simply sat at my kitchen table, exactly where he used to sit after work. I poured coffee. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said something that surprised me. She stopped giving me your messages. I looked up. What? Some of them. I frowned. What do you mean? He rubbed his forehead. I found texts this morning. My stomach tightened. What texts? He opened his phone. There were messages from you. I stared. I sent those. They never appeared on my phone. My heart began to sink. He continued. She blocked some calls. I couldn't speak. She told me you were busy. He looked down. Sometimes she said you didn't feel well. Memories suddenly returned. Phone calls that weren't answered. Messages that never received replies. Holidays canceled at the last minute. Birthdays postponed. I had blamed work, stress, marriage, but now another possibility appeared. Ethan looked devastated. She told me you preferred being alone. I quietly shook my head. I never said that. I know. He leaned back. There were so many little things. What things? He closed his eyes. She said your neighborhood wasn't safe. It isn't dangerous. She said visiting upset you. I stared at him. She said you didn't understand our lives. Silence filled the kitchen. I suddenly remembered several moments. Madison answering Ethan's phone. Madison canceling plans. Madison speaking for him. At the time, none of it seemed unusual. Now every memory looked different. Ethan spoke again. Do you remember Christmas 3 years ago? Yes. You called. I nodded. Madison told me you wanted to spend the holiday alone. My eyes widened. I begged you to come. He looked shocked. What? I cried after you said no. His face lost color. I never spoke to you. The room became very quiet because we had both discovered something painful. Distance had not happened naturally. Someone had helped create it. Not entirely, not completely, but enough. Ethan covered his face. Oh my God. I watched my son carefully. This was the real heartbreak. Not the loans, not the money, not even the insults. It was the realization that years had disappeared. Years he could never recover. Years Richard never got to see. Years his mother spent alone. He whispered something. What? She was afraid of losing me. I nodded slowly. And I was afraid of losing her. Those fears had created the perfect silence. At noon, Claire arrived. She brought soup and sandwiches. She hugged Ethan tightly. He looked embarrassed. I should have called you. She smiled. You should have. They sat together for almost an hour. Claire explained the documents, the loans, the protections, the property records. She answered questions patiently. Ethan listened carefully. When she finished, he looked at me. You protected me. I smiled sadly. I tried. He shook his head. No. His voice became emotional. You protected me from things I didn't even know existed. Claire quietly stood. I'll leave you two alone. After she left, Ethan walked through the house. He stopped beside family photographs. His first bicycle, his graduation, his wedding, Richard standing proudly beside him. When he reached the hallway, he stopped. His father's work boots still sat near the closet. I had never moved them. Ethan stared at them. Dad always said something. What? He smiled faintly. Pay attention to the people who love you quietly. I nodded. That sounds like him. He looked at me. I stopped paying attention. For the first time since the dinner, anger finally appeared. Not toward me, toward himself. I was so busy building a life that I forgot the people who built mine. Tears filled my eyes, because mothers rarely hear their children say these things. He sat beside me again. Mom. Yes, if Dad were here, what would he tell me? I looked toward the window. The afternoon sunlight had finally appeared. Richard would have known exactly what to say. He always did. I smiled softly. He'd tell you to stop looking backward. Ethan listened. He'd tell you to fix what you still can. His eyes filled with tears again. And if I can't, I reached for his hand. Then you start with what remains. He squeezed my hand tightly. For the first time in many years, I felt my son returning. Not completely. Not all at once. But slowly. like sunlight entering a dark room. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the yard. Inside, two people sat at an old kitchen table. A mother, a son, and between us sat all the years we had lost, years that could never return. But perhaps, if we were careful, there were still years ahead that belonged to us. Neither of us knew what would happen with Madison. Neither of us knew whether the marriage could survive. But one truth had finally become impossible to ignore. My son had begun to see. And once a person truly sees, life can never return to the comfortable darkness that came before. 3 days passed before I heard from Madison. During those 3 days, Ethan barely returned home. He stayed in a small hotel near his office. He told me he needed space. Space to think. Space to breathe. Space to understand how his life had changed in a single evening. Every morning, he came to my house before work. Every evening, he stopped by again. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we sat quietly. Neither of us tried to solve everything. There are wounds that cannot be repaired with conversations. They require time. On Monday afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying a cardboard box. "What's that?" I asked. He placed it on the kitchen table. "My father's things." I looked inside. Richard's old tools, a fishing hat, several photographs, a small wooden clock, the things Ethan had stored in his garage for years. "I found them this morning." His voice sounded tired. "Madison wanted to throw them away last year." I looked up. "What?" He nodded. "She said they were taking up space." I gently touched Richard's old hammer. Suddenly, another memory returned. Richard standing in our garage, teaching Ethan how to hold that same hammer, teaching him to measure twice and cut once, teaching him patience. Ethan sat down. I said no. I looked at him. But eventually I moved everything into boxes. He stared at his father's tools. "I don't know when I started letting go of everything." The sadness in his voice frightened me, because people often discover who they have become only after something breaks. Around noon, Claire visited again. She brought legal papers. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, simply information. She spread the documents across my kitchen table. "The mortgage company has questions." Ethan looked worried. "What kind of questions?" "The property ownership arrangement." He rubbed his forehead. "Can we lose the house?" Claire answered honestly. "Probably not." I felt Ethan relax slightly. "But there are still financial problems." He nodded. "I understand." Claire looked at him carefully. "You'll need to decide how much responsibility you want to assume." He stared at the documents. "What about Madison?" Claire remained quiet. Finally, she answered. "That depends on your marriage." After she left, Ethan sat alone in my living room. He looked at old family photographs, pictures from Christmas, vacations, birthdays. There was one photograph of Richard and me standing beside Ethan on his college graduation day. He picked it up. "I was so proud." "You should have been." He shook his head. "I thought success meant making more money than Dad." I looked at him. "What do you think now?" He stared at the photograph. "I think he was the richest man I ever knew." That evening, my phone rang. Madison. For several seconds, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Hello?" Her voice sounded weak. "Can we talk?" I remained quiet. "Please." I agreed to meet her the following afternoon. When I told Ethan, he looked surprised. "You don't have to." "I know." "Why?" I thought carefully before answering. Because anger answers very few questions. The next day, I met Madison at a small coffee shop. She looked exhausted. No makeup, no expensive clothes, no confidence, only exhaustion. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry." I studied her face. She seemed smaller, older, almost frightened. "I know." Tears appeared in her eyes. "I don't know how everything became so bad." I stirred my coffee. "I think you do." She looked down. "My father lost his business when I was 13. I listened. "We lost our house." Her voice trembled. "My mother worked 3 jobs. She wiped her eyes. "I promised myself I'd never live like that." I remembered what she had said during dinner. Fear. It always came back to fear. She continued. "When I met Ethan, he was kind." She smiled sadly. "He didn't care about money." "No." "He loved people." I nodded. "Yes." She lowered her eyes. "And I was afraid he would become satisfied." I frowned. "Satisfied? Ordinary." The word hurt. Not because of me, because of Ethan. She had spent years believing ordinary meant failure. But Richard and I had spent our lives believing ordinary was beautiful. She looked at me. "When I learned you helped with the house, I felt ashamed." "Why?" "Because your family had done what mine never could." She cried quietly. And instead of being grateful, I became resentful. For the first time, I truly understood her. Not her actions, not her cruelty, but her wounds. And wounded people sometimes create wounded homes. She looked at me. "Does Ethan hate me?" I answered honestly. "No." Her eyes filled with hope. "But he's hurt." She nodded. "I know." That evening, Ethan came over again. I told him about the conversation. He listened quietly. "Do you believe her?" "Yes." He looked surprised. "After everything?" I nodded. "Pain doesn't excuse what she did." He looked down. But understanding and forgiveness aren't always the same thing." He sat quietly for a long time. Then he said something unexpected. "I don't know if I can go back." I wasn't surprised, because some damage changes a relationship forever. The question becomes whether something new can be built afterward. The following morning, Ethan returned to the house he shared with Madison. He called me several hours later. "Mom?" "Yes." "I'm packing some things." My heart sank. "Are you leaving?" "I think I need to." I heard silence on the other end. Then she asked me if I still love her. "What did you say?" He took a long breath. I said, "I don't know who we are anymore." The answer broke my heart. Because marriages rarely end in a single moment. They end through thousands of tiny injuries, thousands of ignored conversations, thousands of fears left unspoken. That evening, Ethan arrived carrying 2 suitcases. He placed them beside my front door. "I booked an apartment." I looked at him. "For how long?" "I don't know." He sat down. His face looked older, as though the previous week had aged him years. He finally looked at me. "I asked her something before I left." "What?" He swallowed. "I asked if she ever loved you." I waited. She said she didn't know how. The room became quiet. Outside, autumn winds moved through the trees. Inside, my son sat beside me. His marriage was falling apart. His future looked uncertain. His heart was broken. Yet somehow, for the first time in years, he was finally present. He looked at me. I'm sorry for all the years. I took his hand. Don't waste more years apologizing. His eyes filled with tears. What should I do? I thought of Richard, of everything life had taught me, and finally I answered. Tell the truth. He nodded. To Madison. To yourself. Because that was the real battle, not money, not property, not documents. Only truth. And sometimes the truth costs us everything we thought we wanted, but it gives us back who we really are. 2 weeks passed. Autumn slowly surrendered to winter. The trees outside my kitchen window stood bare, and the first frost appeared on the grass each morning. Life had become quieter, though not necessarily easier. Ethan moved into a small apartment across town. He said he needed space. Not from me. From the life he no longer recognized. Every Saturday morning, he came to my house. Sometimes we had breakfast. Sometimes we visited the cemetery where Richard was buried. And sometimes we simply sat together, saying very little. There is a certain kind of healing that happens in silence. One Saturday, Ethan stood beside his father's grave for a long time. The cold wind moved through the cemetery. The sky hung low and gray. Finally, he spoke. Dad, I messed everything up. I stood several feet away. I didn't interrupt. He continued. I forgot who I was. His shoulders trembled. I forgot who raised me. When he returned to the car, his eyes were red. I feel like I failed him. I started the engine. No. He looked at me. You lost your way. He nodded slowly. Is there a difference? Yes, because failure is permanent. Being lost means you can still come home. Meanwhile, Madison had moved into a small condominium owned by one of her co-workers. The financial problems continued. Several accounts needed attention. The mortgage company required meetings. Lawyers became involved. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, but years of hidden decisions now demanded answers. Ethan attended every meeting. He took responsibility for the debts connected to his name. He cooperated. He listened. And for the first time in many years, he stopped running from uncomfortable truths. One afternoon, he visited me after one of those meetings. He looked exhausted. How did Dad do it? What? Life. I smiled softly. He wasn't afraid of living simply. Ethan sat at my kitchen table. Everything became about money. I poured him coffee. When? He thought for a moment. I don't know. But I did. Not exactly. Yet I understood how people slowly change. Success becomes a goal, then an identity, then a requirement, and finally, a prison. Ethan stared into his coffee. I spent years trying to impress people I don't even like. I laughed quietly. Your father would have enjoyed hearing that. He smiled. He'd tell me I was an idiot. No. What would he say? I thought carefully. He'd say you're finally growing up. Several days later, my phone rang again. Madison. This time, her voice sounded calmer. I was wondering if Ethan is okay. He misses you. Silence. Does he? Yes. She began crying. I miss him too. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, Can I tell you something honestly? Of course. I don't think I ever knew how to love anyone. The words stayed with me long after the call ended, because some people grow up learning that love means security, others learn that love means achievement, and some never learn at all. The following week, Ethan surprised me. He arrived carrying groceries. What are you doing? Making dinner. I laughed. You can't cook. That's why you're helping. For nearly 2 hours, we worked together. Chicken soup, biscuits, roasted vegetables, things Richard loved. At one point, Ethan stopped. What? He smiled. I forgot how this house smells. I looked around the kitchen. Cinnamon, coffee, bread, soup, the ordinary smells of ordinary lives, the very things Madison had once dismissed. Yet somehow, those simple things had become precious again. While dinner cooked, Ethan opened one of Richard's old boxes. Inside sat dozens of handwritten letters, receipts, cards, photographs, and a small envelope. My name was written on the front. Jordyn. I frowned. I've never seen that. Ethan handed it to me. The handwriting belonged to Richard. My hands began shaking. The envelope had apparently fallen behind a drawer years earlier. I carefully opened it. Inside was a letter. Short, only 1 page. I read silently at first. Then Ethan asked, What does it say? Tears filled my eyes. I handed him the letter. He read aloud. If you're reading this, then life has probably become difficult. Remember something for me? Wealth isn't what you own. It's who sits at your table when life becomes hard. Protect each other. Forgive when you can. And never allow pride to make you strangers. The room became completely silent. Richard had written the letter shortly before his death. Neither of us had ever seen it. Ethan read the final line. Take care of your mother. One day, you'll understand how much she loved you. He lowered the paper. Tears rolled down his face. I understand now. I couldn't speak. Sometimes the people we lose continue guiding us, even years later. That night, we ate dinner together. Just the two of us. No expensive dishes, no guests, no crystal glasses, only soup, bread, and conversation. At one point, Ethan looked at me. Do you think people deserve second chances? I knew what he was asking. Sometimes. What about Madison? I thought carefully. She deserves honesty. He nodded. And forgiveness. That's different. The following Sunday, he met Madison. They walked through a public park. Neither of them wore wedding rings. Neither knew what came next. When he returned that evening, I could see the sadness in his eyes. How did it go? He sat quietly. She apologized. I waited. She said she spent her whole life being afraid. And he looked out my window. I believe her. I nodded. But his voice grew softer. I don't know if love can survive after trust disappears. That night after he left, I sat alone in Richard's chair. The house felt peaceful. Not because everything had been repaired, because truth had finally entered our lives. The phone rang once more. It was Claire. How's our patient? I laughed. Which one? Both. I looked toward the empty kitchen. The sun is returning. And the mother? I smiled. The mother never left. Outside, snow began falling for the first time that year. The world grew quiet. And somewhere across town, my son sat alone in his apartment. His marriage stood on uncertain ground. His future remained unclear. But something important had happened. He had stopped measuring his life by money. He had stopped chasing approval. And for the first time since his father's death, he had begun building something Richard would recognize. Not success, not status, something far more valuable. Home. January arrived with heavy snow. The streets around my neighborhood disappeared beneath white blankets, and the world seemed quieter than usual. Winter has a way of forcing people indoors, forcing them to sit with themselves. For Ethan, that winter became a season of truth. Nearly 2 months had passed since the dinner. The legal meetings continued. The financial records had finally been organized. Claire worked closely with the attorneys, helping everyone understand exactly what had happened. The situation was not as terrible as Ethan had first feared. Most of the debt could be repaid. The house would not be lost. There would be no criminal charges. But there would be consequences. And consequences often hurt more than punishment. One snowy afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying several folders. He placed them on my kitchen table. I signed everything. I poured him coffee. What kind of papers? The financial agreements. He sat heavily in his chair. The accounts are being closed. I nodded. And Madison? He looked toward the window. She agreed to sell some investments. That's good. He rubbed his eyes. She also agreed to repay part of the debt herself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The storm outside continued. The old clock ticked quietly. Finally, Ethan said something I had not expected. I don't hate her. I looked at him. I know. I thought I would. I smiled softly. Hate is exhausting. He nodded. But I can't trust her. That was different. Trust and forgiveness are not the same. One can exist without the other. Several days later, Madison asked to see me again. This time, we met at my house. When I opened the door, she looked nervous. She carried no designer handbag, no expensive coat, only a small box. We sat at my kitchen table. She placed the box in front of me. Inside were my pearl earrings, the ones Richard had bought me. I looked confused. You left them at the house after the dinner. I remembered. That terrible night. The humiliation. The papers. The silence. I had forgotten them. She looked around my kitchen. For the first time, she truly seemed to see it. The old cabinets. The worn curtains. Richard's chair. The photographs. The small imperfections. I used to think this house was sad. I said nothing. She continued. Now I think it's beautiful. Tears appeared in her eyes. I spent my entire life chasing things. I looked at her. And what did you find? She laughed quietly. Nothing. For several minutes we simply talked, not as enemies, not as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, only as two women who had both experienced loss. She told me more about her childhood, her father's bankruptcy, moving from apartment to apartment, watching her mother cry over unpaid bills, living with fear, constant fear. I thought money could protect me. I answered gently. It can protect your house. She lowered her eyes. But not your heart. No. She cried quietly. I hurt Ethan. I nodded. I hurt you. Again, I nodded. She looked directly at me. Why aren't you angry? That question surprised me, because perhaps I had been angry for years. But anger changes over time. Eventually, it becomes something else. I looked at Richard's photograph. My husband spent 42 years teaching me that people are more complicated than their worst mistakes. She wiped her eyes. Do you forgive me? I thought carefully, because forgiveness should never be spoken casually. Finally, I answered. I don't want to carry bitterness. She cried harder, but I continued. That doesn't mean everything returns to the way it was. She nodded. I understand. Before she left, she stopped beside the front door. I never knew how much Ethan loved you. I smiled sadly. Neither did he. The following week, Ethan invited me to dinner. Not at the large house, not at a restaurant, at his small apartment. When I arrived, I almost laughed. The kitchen was a disaster. Pots everywhere. Flour on the counter. Burned bread. He looked embarrassed. I tried. You certainly did. We ordered pizza, and somehow that simple dinner became one of the happiest evenings we had shared in years. Halfway through the meal, Ethan became serious. I made a decision. I waited. I'm filing for legal separation. The words hung quietly between us. I had expected them, yet hearing them still made me sad. Are you sure? He looked down. I still care about her. I know, but every conversation feels like we're talking about people we used to be. I understood. Sometimes love survives, sometimes it changes. Sometimes it simply cannot carry the weight of everything that happened. He looked at me. Do you think Dad would be disappointed? I smiled. Your father believed honesty mattered. Ethan nodded. I'm finally being honest. Several weeks later, the paperwork was filed. No fighting, no revenge, no courtroom drama. Just two people accepting that something had broken. Madison sent me a letter, not because she had to, because she wanted to. She thanked me. She apologized. And at the bottom, she wrote something that stayed with me. I spent years trying not to become poor that I forgot how to become kind. I folded the letter carefully. Some people spend entire lifetimes without recognizing their mistakes. At least she had. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan and I visited Richard's grave again. Snow covered the ground. The cemetery looked peaceful. He stood quietly beside his father. Then he spoke aloud. I'm trying, Dad. The wind moved through the trees. I lost my way. He smiled slightly, but Mom found me. Tears filled my eyes. Because perhaps that was the truth. Not the papers, not the money, not the house. Only a mother refusing to give up on her son. As we walked back toward the car, Ethan suddenly stopped. What? He looked at me. Do you regret helping me buy the house? The answer came immediately. No. Even after everything, I smiled. Especially after everything. He looked confused. Why? Because finally I understood. The money had never been the gift. The house had never been the gift. Even the protection Richard left behind was not the real gift. The gift was this moment. A son returning home. A mother no longer forgotten. A family learning what truly matters. Outside snow continued falling, and for the first time in many years, neither of us felt alone. Spring arrived slowly that year. The snow disappeared first. Then the frozen ground softened. And finally, Tiny green leaves returned to the trees outside my kitchen window. Life has a strange way of reminding us that nothing stays broken forever. Not winter, not grief, not even families. Nearly 6 months had passed since the dinner. 6 months since Madison called me a beggar. 6 months since Ethan opened the folder. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. Sometimes it felt like another lifetime. One Saturday morning, Ethan arrived carrying a toolbox. I looked surprised. "What are you doing?" He smiled. "Your porch needs repairs." I laughed softly. "How do you know? You mentioned it 3 years ago." The answer caught me off guard. 3 years. For 3 years he had remembered. For 3 years he had been absent. Yet somehow the memory had remained. We spent the entire afternoon outside. The wooden steps had become loose. The railing leaned slightly. Richard used to handle those repairs himself. Watching Ethan work with his father's old tools brought tears to my eyes. At one point, he stopped. "What?" He looked down at the hammer. "I haven't used this since Dad died." I sat quietly beside him. "He'd be proud." Ethan smiled. "I think he'd criticize my measurements." I laughed. "He certainly would." The sound of laughter felt unfamiliar. Not because it had disappeared, because it had been absent for too long. After finishing the repairs, we sat on the porch drinking iced tea. The air felt warm. Birds sang nearby. For the first time in years, neither of us seemed to be carrying anything. No documents, no debt, no lies, only time. A few days later, Ethan called. "I sold the house." The words surprised me. "The big house." "Yes." I remained silent. "It was too much." He sounded relieved. "Too expensive." "No." He paused. "It never felt like home." That answer made perfect sense, because houses and homes are not the same thing. He continued, "I'm buying something smaller." "Where?" "Closer to you." I looked out the window. "You don't have to." "I want to." Several weeks later, Ethan showed me the property, a modest 2-bedroom home. Small yard, simple kitchen, old floors. Nothing impressive, nothing luxurious, but something about it felt peaceful. "What do you think?" he asked. I walked slowly through the rooms. Sunlight entered through large windows. The living room overlooked several trees. The kitchen looked warm. And somehow I could imagine family there. "I think your father would like it." He smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped." The legal separation with Madison continued quietly. Neither of them fought. Neither wanted revenge. They met occasionally, talked, shared meals, sometimes cried. But both had changed. And sometimes people grow in different directions. One afternoon, Madison came to see me again. This time, she brought flowers. Not expensive ones, daisies, my favorite. She looked healthier, calmer. "I started therapy." I smiled. "How is it going?" She laughed softly. "Painfully." We sat together on the porch, the same porch Ethan had repaired. She looked around. "It's strange." "What is—" "I used to think people who lived simply had less." I waited. "Now I think they have more." The wind moved gently through the trees. She looked at me. "I spent years trying to impress strangers." "And now—" She smiled sadly. "Now I'm trying to understand myself." That may have been the most honest thing she had ever said. Before leaving, she turned toward me. Thank you. For what? For not destroying me. I thought about that. Because I could have. Legally, financially, emotionally, but destruction rarely heals anyone. She hugged me before leaving, for the first time. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. Summer arrived. Ethan closed on his new house. The first thing he did was invite me for dinner. Not a large dinner. Not a party. Just us. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something. The dining table was small. Only 4 chairs. The kitchen smelled like chicken roasting in the oven. There were no expensive decorations. No wine display. No designer dishes. Only warmth. I made dinner. I smiled. Should I be worried? Probably. We both laughed. After dinner, he handed me something, an envelope. What is this? Open it. Inside sat several documents. I looked confused. What are these? The house papers. My heart tightened. Ethan, he interrupted gently. I want you to see them. I slowly read the first page. Only his name appeared. I looked up. You don't need my protection anymore. Tears filled my eyes. But there was another page. I turned it over. My name, not ownership, not financial control. Only one sentence. If anything happens to me, this home belongs to Jordyn Scott. I looked at him. What is this? He smiled. Family. I couldn't speak, because for months I had feared that the papers I placed on the dinner table had destroyed my son. Instead, perhaps they had saved him. Later that evening, we sat outside, watching the sunset. He looked toward the sky. I understand something now. What? My entire life I thought success meant becoming bigger. I listened. More money. He paused. Bigger house. Another pause. More impressive. He smiled. But Dad had it right. And what was that? He looked at me. Protect the people you love. The sun disappeared slowly. The world became quiet. And in that silence, I realized something. The house Richard and I helped buy had never truly mattered. The money had never mattered. The papers had only revealed truth. But the real gift had been this: a son rebuilding his life, a mother no longer waiting by the phone, a family learning to value people over appearances. As we sat together, Ethan finally asked the question he had carried for months. Mom. Yes. When Madison called you a beggar? I looked at him. Were you afraid? I thought carefully. Then I answered honestly. No. He seemed surprised. Why? Because by that point in my life I had already learned something. A woman who has buried her husband, worked for decades, raised a child, and survived loneliness, cannot be made poor by another person's words. I smiled softly. The only thing I was afraid of was losing my son. He reached over and took my hand. You won't. And for the first time in many years, I believed him. Autumn returned 1 year later. The leaves outside my window turned gold again. The air became cooler. The evenings grew shorter. And as I stood in my kitchen baking an apple pie, I realized that exactly 1 year had passed since the dinner that changed our lives. 1 year since Madison called me a beggar. 1 year since Ethan opened the folder. 1 year since the truth finally entered our family. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon. Richard's old radio played softly in the background, and for the first time in many years, my home no longer felt lonely. At 11 o'clock, someone knocked on the door. Ethan. He carried a small box. "I brought something." "What is it?" He smiled. "You'll see." He looked different now. Not younger, not happier, but peaceful. The shadows beneath his eyes had disappeared. His shoulders no longer carried the weight they once did. He had sold the large house, moved into the smaller one, finished the financial agreements, and several months earlier his legal separation from Madison had quietly become final. No court battle, no hatred, only acceptance. Life sometimes ends relationships not because people are evil, but because they can no longer grow together. We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, the same kitchen where we had cried, the same kitchen where we had rediscovered each other. He placed the box in front of me. "Open it." Inside sat a framed photograph. I stared. It was one of the oldest family pictures we had. Richard stood in the backyard grilling hamburgers. I sat beside him, and 8-year-old Ethan stood between us holding a baseball glove. I smiled through tears. "Where did you find this?" "I spent weeks looking." He looked down. "I realized most of my happiest memories happened here." I touched the photograph. Richard looked young, healthy, strong. None of us knew then what life would bring. None of us knew how precious ordinary days really were. That afternoon, we drove to the cemetery. It had become our tradition. We brought fresh flowers. We cleaned the headstone, and for several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan said quietly, "Dad, I think I finally understand." The wind moved gently through the trees. "I spent years chasing things that never mattered." He smiled sadly. "I forgot the people who did." I stood beside him. 1 year earlier, I had feared losing my son forever. Now I watched him stand beside his father again, not physically, but emotionally, and perhaps that was enough. On the drive home, Ethan surprised me. "Mom." "Yes, I saw Madison last week." I looked at him. "How is she?" He smiled softly. "Better." After the divorce, Madison had moved to another city. She continued therapy. She returned to work. She lived in a much smaller apartment, and according to Ethan, she had changed. Not completely. People rarely change completely, but enough. She asked about you. "What did you tell her?" "That you're doing well." I smiled. "Good." He hesitated. "She wanted me to tell you something." "What?" He looked at the road. "She said you taught her what wealth actually looks like." Tears filled my eyes, because perhaps that was the final lesson. Not the papers, not the house, not the money, only understanding. Several weeks later, Ethan invited me to dinner at his new house. This time, there were 4 chairs around the table, not because he expected guests, because he wanted room. Room for family, room for life, room for people. As we sat eating dinner, he suddenly asked, "Do you remember what Madison called you?" I smiled faintly. "A beggar." He shook his head. "I've thought about that word all year." I waited, and I finally understand something. "What?" He looked directly at me. "The beggar wasn't you." The room became quiet, because he was right. Madison had been begging for approval, begging for status, begging for safety, and Ethan had been begging for success. Meanwhile, I had already possessed the things they desperately searched for: love, family, peace, and the courage to live simply. That evening after dinner, Ethan walked me outside. The sky had turned orange. The neighborhood was quiet. He looked at me. "Thank you." "For what?" "For the papers." I smiled. "You hated them." "I did." He laughed softly. "But they saved my life." I thought about that, because perhaps they had. Not financially, spiritually, emotionally. They forced him to see, and seeing changed everything. As I prepared to leave, he handed me a key. "What's this?" "My house." I frowned. "You already gave me one." He smiled. "This one is different." Attached to the key was a small silver tag. It contained only 4 words. Always welcome. Always family. I could not speak. Because every mother fears one thing: being forgotten. And for years, I had quietly feared that. Not because Ethan stopped loving me, because life had carried him somewhere I could not follow. But now, he had found his way back. Several days later, I sat alone on my porch. The same porch he repaired. The same porch where Richard and I spent countless evenings. The sun slowly disappeared. Leaves moved through the yard. And I thought about the woman who had been called a beggar. Perhaps if someone had asked me 1 year earlier whether I was poor, I might have answered yes. I had lost my husband, lost my daily companionship, lost many years with my son. But now I understood. Poor people are not always those without money. Sometimes they are the people who possess everything except gratitude, everything except love, everything except peace. The folder still sits in my desk. The papers remain exactly where I placed them, not because I need them, not because they matter, but because they remind me of something. Truth can hurt. Truth can destroy illusions. Truth can change families. But sometimes, truth also brings people home. And if Richard could see us now, I think he would smile. His son finally understands. His wife is no longer alone. And the family he worked his entire life to protect has finally learned what truly matters. Not houses, not money, not appearances. Only the people who remain seated at your table when everything else disappears. Afterward, lessons and reflections. Sometimes the deepest wounds inside families are not caused by money, inheritance, or property. They come from pride, silence, fear, and the belief that success matters more than love. Jordyn spent years being misunderstood. She never demanded gratitude. She never used her sacrifice to control her son. She simply loved quietly, as many mothers do. Ethan learned that success means very little if it costs the people who helped build your life. Wealth without relationships becomes loneliness. Ambition without gratitude becomes emptiness. Madison's story reminds us that fear can quietly control our decisions. Fear of poverty, fear of failure, and fear of judgment can turn good people into strangers. But recognizing our mistakes is often the first step toward healing. Richard's lesson remained true throughout the entire story. Protect the people who love you quietly. Parents grow older. Phone calls become fewer. Years disappear quickly. And one day, we realize that the people who stood beside us all our lives were asking for very little. Only our time, our attention, and our love. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts below. Have you ever experienced distance inside your own family? What lesson stayed with you the most? Please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Your stories may help someone else feel less alone. And if these stories mean something to you, don't forget to subscribe and join us again for another journey about family forgiveness and finding our way back home.